All right, let's move on to the nitrogen cycle. This cycle and this material is some of the most difficult material you will have to learn this semester, so take a deep breath and hang on. You guys can do this. Remember that our atmosphere is primarily made up of nitrogen gas, represented in my picture here by these N2 molecules. Nitrogen gas molecules are highly stable. They have a triple bond. In order to fix nitrogen, the first thing that we have to do is separate these two nitrogen atoms from one another. In other words, we have to break apart that highly stable triple bond, and it's not easy. We call this first step fixation, but we aren't completely fixing the nitrogen in this step. We're simply taking that first step leading to the complete nitrogen fixation. So don't get confused there. There are two ways that we can fix nitrogen or split apart these N2 molecules. The first way is with lightning. I don't think I have gray here, so I'm going to draw a cloud over here with a lightning bolt. Okay, and some more. We'll draw some N2s over here. Lightning provides a huge amount of energy. Every time a lightning bolt strikes through the air, it bumps into thousands of nitrogen gas molecules and splits them apart into single nitrogen atoms. So here's our picture. We've got our nitrogen molecules, and the lightning comes through and it breaks apart our nitrogen gas molecules into single nitrogen atoms. Okay, so this is one way to go through fixation. The second way we can fix nitrogen atoms is with specialized bacteria called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And I'm going to abbreviate that by N-fixing bacteria. These bacteria live in little bumps called nodules on the roots of legume plants. Okay, so this plant here is a legume. See my little green bean? That's my green bean. Okay, so we're basically talking beans. Legumes are plants whose seeds come in pods. And if you actually go and pull up, say, a green bean plant out of your garden, you look really closely at the roots, you'll see these teeny tiny little bumps all over, and these are the nodules on the roots, and the nitrogen-fixing bacteria live in these nodules. These bacteria grab hold of the nitrogen gas molecules that are found in the little pockets of air between the soil particles. Okay, so here they are. And they basically split apart the nitrogen atoms, giving us single nitrogens. So we'll draw them kind of going through these, and this one coming through too. And we end up with, again, our single nitrogens. So that completes the first step of the nitrogen cycle, which is fixation of nitrogen gas, or N2. The next step is called nitrification. The purpose of this step is to get the single nitrogen atoms into a form that plants can take up. Now, you do not need to understand all the intermediate steps of nitrification. What I want you to understand for this class is that single nitrogen atoms are converted into nitrates. We want nitrates because green plants take up this form of nitrogen. So here's our single nitrogens here, and we're going to just draw an arrow and write nitrification above it to represent this process. And the result of this process is nitrates. Okay, that's what we want. That's what plants are taking in. Now, as it turns out, when lightning fixes our N2 molecule, or a nitrogen gas molecule in the atmosphere, the resulting single nitrogen atoms bond with oxygen in the air, and then those molecules dissolve in the water that's in the air, and we basically get nitrates that are airborne. And those nitrates precipitate down into the soil. So any of the single nitrogens that got split apart using the lightning get to actually skip nitrification. So we're going to draw an arrow here of these single nitrogens and draw it right up here to nitrates, because we basically got to skip ahead and get nitrates. Okay, once we have nitrates, we can move on to the next step of our nitrogen cycle, which is assimilation. Assimilate means to take in and make part of oneself. In this step, green plants, not just legumes, but all green plants, take up nitrates and incorporate the nitrogen into the plant. We now finally have fixed the nitrogen. It is in an organic form. It took 3 steps to do it, but we did it. Now the nitrogen is available to living beings like you and me. Okay, so here's our nitrates. We're going to draw an arrow up into our green plant here. Next to this arrow, I'm going to write assimilation. That's the process that's taking place here. And this plant now contains organic nitrogen. Okay, it's in the leaves and, in the seeds and all that. The next step in the cycle is the food chain. The nitrogen is taken up by an animal when it eats the plant. And that nitrogen gets passed up the food chain when a predator comes along and eats the animal that ate the plant, and so on. Okay, so let's just draw dink, dink. Okay, and the ant is eating some food, and then we'll draw our bird again. Wow, it's a good thing I did not go into the field of art. Okay, here's my bird. And he sees this ant, yum yum. And so he's going to eat the ant. And now he's got organic nitrogen in him. Okay, so the only way that the nitrogen leaves our bodies is either in waste. Okay, this is some bird poo and it's got some N's in it. So I'll write fecal here. Or, of course, if our poor little bird happens to unfortunately slam into somebody's window, or I don't know, he just gets old and dies. Okay. His body still contains organic nitrogen in it. So our waste and our bodies undergo the next step of the nitrogen cycle, which is decomposition. Decomposition. And this is basically the process where bacteria and decomposers like beetles, worms, etc. come along and break apart the waste and matter into smaller and smaller pieces, which still contain the nitrogen, which gets mixed back into the soil. This decomposed nitrogen makes its way into the soil, dissolves in water, and turns back into nitrates. Okay, so here's the waste and the dead body, goes through the process of decomposition, and we get back here to nitrates. Now, once you have nitrates again, they can go one of 2 ways. They can either re-enter the cycle, get taken back up into the plant by assimilation, enter back into the food chain. I forgot to write food chain right here. Food chain. And go back into decomposition. And so you basically get this little mini cycle right here that goes from assimilation to food chain to decomposition. And these nitrates and this nitrogen can keep cycling around there. The other way that these nitrates can go is into the last step of our nitrogen cycle called denitrification. So I'm going to draw an arrow here. Denitrification. Remember those nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live on the roots of legumes? Well, it turns out there's another kind of bacteria that are found living freely within the soil. They especially like waterlogged soil or real boggy, marshy areas. And these bacteria are called denitrifying bacteria. I'm just going to draw them as little red dots living freely in the soil. They're not attached to, any roots of plants or anything like that. They're just found in the soil. Okay. So this denitrifying bacteria performs this process of denitrification. Basically, they take excess nitrates in the soil that aren't being taken up by plants, and they turn it back into nitrogen gas, the inorganic form of nitrogen, which makes its way back up into the atmosphere. Let me make this go away. and we get back to where we started. So we have now completed our cycle. Okay, so let's review real quick. There are basically 6 steps to the nitrogen cycle. In step 1, we have fixation of nitrogen, and we can do that in one of 2 ways. We can do it by lightning, which is shown in this picture with a red arrow, or we can also fix our nitrogen with the help of nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which is shown by the blue arrow. Notice that the picture of the plant there is a legume. It's a native legume that we have here, which is cat claw acacia. And then on the roots, you can see those little nodules where the nitrogen-fixing bacteria are living. And so that blue arrow comes through and out and shows that you now have single nitrogen atoms. Okay, and step 2 is nitrification. That's represented in this picture by the green arrow. In nitrification, remember, we're taking the single nitrogen atoms and undergoing this nitrification process, which results in nitrates. Now, don't forget that the nitrogen gas molecules that were split apart by lightning kind of get to skip ahead and go straight to nitrates because those single nitrogens bond with oxygen in the air and then dissolve in water, which gives us nitrates, and those fall down into the soil. Step 3 of the nitrogen cycle is assimilation. This is when the plants take in the nitrates and incorporate that nitrogen into their bodies. So we now finally have organic nitrogen in the plant. Step 4 is the food chain, shown here by the dark gray or almost black color. The step 3, by the way, assimilation, is that purple arrow. So along comes a cottontail rabbit. He eats the green plant. In this case, I have a picture of a creosote bush there. And he gets organic nitrogen. The coyote eats the rabbit. That's how he gets nitrogen. The mountain lion eats the coyote. That's how he gets nitrogen. Step 5 is decomposition. All those brown little shapes below the animals represent the waste that those animals are creating. In other words, their poo. And also, when they die, their bodies still contain that nitrogen, and so they undergo decomposition, which breaks down that matter into small pieces, and those nitrogen atoms that are contained in the waste and in their bodies dissolve back into water and turn back into nitrates in the soil. Now, those nitrates can enter into the cycle again, go through assimilation, back into the food chain, back through decomposition, and go through this mini cycle within the overall nitrogen cycle, or they can go to the last step of the nitrogen cycle, step 6, which is denitrification, and that's represented by the light green arrow here. Remember that there are denitrifying bacteria that live freely in soil, especially waterlogged soil. And these guys take up the excess nitrates in the soil that aren't being used by plants and turn that back into nitrogen gas, which makes its way back up into the atmosphere, completing our nitrogen cycle. Okay, let's take a look at the nitrogen cycle worksheet and see if we can figure it out. Make sure to pay attention because you're going to see something very similar to this on your exam. Okay, this should look like the worksheet that you guys had for homework. So let's go and see if we can fill in the answers. I'm going to let's see, I think I'll try and write them on the worksheet, but if it gets too scrunchy, I might have to write some over here. So I'll just write answers. So pull out your worksheets as we go through this. Okay, let's look here. And make sure that, don't forget that I gave you some of the hints at the bottom, which I don't have shown here. So I'm just going to read them off. Okay, number 1 and 2 is pointing to this arrow going through this legume plant. And the hint or the question says, what step is happening here? And what organism makes this step possible? So let's take a look at the picture. Everything starts up here with our atmospheric nitrogen gas, N2. So if we follow this arrow down and around, it comes through this legume plant, and that's what number 1 and 2 are asking about. What step is happening here, and what organism makes this possible? Well, the step that's happening here is the first step of the nitrogen cycle, which is fixation of nitrogen gas, of N2. Okay, and the organism that makes that possible is found on the roots of the legume plant. That's your N-fixing bacteria, your nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So those are the answers for number 1 and number 2. Okay, let's see. Number 3 is way over here. So let's see. Follow our arrows around from atmospheric nitrogen. We have some lightning here, and this arrow comes down, and number 3 is pointing to this arrow. And the question says, what step or process is happening here? Remember, there are 2 ways to go through the first step of the nitrogen cycle, fixation. One is with our nitrogen-fixing bacteria on the root of legumes, which is what's happening here. The other way is with lightning. Okay, so we have fixation via lightning happening here. Okay, if you go back through the PowerPoint slides, this would be shown as 1A, and this one is 1B. Okay, let's find number 4. Number 4 is down here. So we go through this fixation. That makes sense because we would get single nitrogens after that. And those single nitrogens are coming through here, along here. And number 4 is looking at this arrow here. And the question says, what step or process is happening here? Well, we know that we need to get nitrates for our plants to take up. So how do we turn single nitrogen atoms into nitrates? Well, that process is called nitrification. Nitrification. Sorry, it's hard to write in this tiny space here. That's step 2 of the overall nitrogen cycle. Now, nitrification, I tried to extend the arrow out here, gives us this right here, number 5. And number 5 says, what is the resulting product of number 4? Hint, you also get it after the process of number 3. This answer here is nitrates. Nitrification gives us nitrates. And remember that the N2 molecules that go through lightning, and we get them out here, these guys bond with oxygen in the air, and that dissolves into water, and you get nitrates already. So that's why this arrow comes all the way down and skips straight over to number 5, which is nitrates. Okay, number 6 is pointing right here, taken up by plant roots, and there's an arrow here, a blue arrow. And number 6 asks, what is the name of this step that is described in the figure? Well, let's see. We know these are nitrates, and it says it's taken up by plant roots. So this is the step where our nitrogen is finally put into the plant. And I know that that is assimilation. Assimilation. The plant is taking in and assimilating that nitrogen. So that's the answer to number 6. Number 7 is in the tree, and the question says, what does the tree contain? In other words, what do we now have after number 6? Well, let's see. We went through assimilation, and we're finally done fixing our nitrogen. So we finally have organic nitrogen, which is the answer for number 7. That's all I wanted you to write, organic nitrogen. You simply need to understand that we now finally have nitrogen that is available to living beings. Okay, number 8's on this arrow here that's going over and pointing to our large herbivore, which is a cow in this case. And it says, what step is pictured here by the cow eating the tree? Well, hopefully that was fairly obvious for you guys. I'm going to write number 8 over here. And this process or this step is called the food chain. Okay, the nitrogen is now able to enter the food chain. Okay, and then of course the cow leaves waste behind, dead animals, feces, urine, dead plants and organisms. These guys all contain nitrogen in them. And there's these 2 arrows here pointing to our number 9. Number 9 asks, what is the step that takes the waste products from the cow and dead plants and breaks it down, forming a miniature cycle within the bigger cycle? So what is this process, this breaking down process that turns the nitrogen that we had locked up in the cow and in the plants back into these nitrates? Well, that process is decomposition. The breaking down. It's breaking it into tiny pieces. Okay, and we get nitrates as a result of that. Those nitrates can then turn right back around and re-enter this little miniature cycle here. So you go from nitrates, assimilation, food chain, decomposition, back to assimilation, back to food chain. So you get sort of this little mini cycle within the overall cycle. But some of these nitrates go this way in this blue arrow here out to number 10. And this says denitrifying bacteria and waterlogged soil. This should have been a big hint to you, denitrifying bacteria. So number 10 asks, what is the step that requires the denitrifying bacteria that are mostly found in waterlogged soil? And it says that there is a hint. This is the step that completes the overall nitrogen cycle. Okay, so denitrifying bacteria undergo what process? Denitrification. They are, whoops, I forgot an F there, denitrification. They are taking the excess nitrates and turning them back into nitrogen gas. And that gets us right back to where we started, thereby completing the nitrogen cycle. Okay, so that concludes this video. Again, it's tough material, so watch this video a few times, go through it, practice it, study for your quiz, and if you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message on Blackboard, and I will see you guys next time.